Hello, everyone. This is Karen Perry with Professors Providing Professional Development. I'm going to talk about genres and formats today, and the subtitle of this presentation is They Might Not Be What You Think. And I listed that because with the trending of genrefying libraries, that's been going on for a while now, the term genre is thrown around very easily. And this can be very misleading for students, for sure, because some things that people are listing as genres aren't genres. They're subgenres at best, categories and subjects, most of the time, or they're formats. And you'll see a few examples of that later on. So let's look at genres first. Basically, you have fiction and nonfiction. Everything else is a subgenre. But of course, we have to have a little more than that because we can't just categorize them like this. We need some more specificity. So let's look at the fiction side. The fiction side branches off into realism and fantasy. So there's two more legs off of the fiction, realism and fantasy. So in the realism, you'll see there's realistic, so modern and contemporary, and then there's historical. On the fantasy side, there's modern and traditional. So let's look a little bit more here. Realism is pretty straightforward, realistic or historical. But then when you get into fantasy, you'll see we're branching off here. Fantasy goes off into, here's the traditional side. So with the traditional then, we have folktale, ballad, fable, legend, myth, and fairy tale. So this is, our 398.2s and other types of traditional stories fall in this sort of fantasy. When you look at the other side of fantasy, you have that modern side. Here is where you're going to get the hard science fiction and soft science fiction, high fantasy and low fantasy. Hard science fiction is the type of science fiction where science is the main part of the story. There's still, of course, the fiction aspect to it. It's, it takes place in space or some other type of scientific thing. It takes place, here on Earth, whatever. But it's the science is the main portion of the story. Soft science fiction is when there's science involved. However, character is a big part of the story. High fantasy is the type of fantasy where you have worlds that have been created, languages have been created. So you're thinking of Lord of the Rings and the Game of Thrones. Those are high fantasies. Low fantasy are fantasy stories that are a little bit more down to earth. They take place in a world that we can recognize a little bit more, but still they have elements that are not possible. So you have talking animals and fairies and things like that. Of course, fairies could appear in high fantasy as well, but so fairies that live in New York City, for instance, would be a low fantasy. So that's the fiction side. Nonfiction, you have informational, but then informational then is broken down into biography, and you see also goes with that is autobiography and memoir. You have narrative fiction and expository fiction. So biography, what a biography is. And then with autobiography and memoir, they're kind of similar, but the thing that separates those two is the timeline. Autobiography is pretty much going to cover the whole span of a person's life, whereas memoir is more maybe of a particular portion of a life. So, autobiography is the whole life of Benjamin Franklin, whereas the memoir, he would have written it when he was spending a summer in France and only covering one particular summer, something like that. Narrative nonfiction is, of course, still a nonfiction text. However, it's written in a way that is more like a story. And a great example of this is The Notorious Benedict Arnold by Steve Shankin. Man, this is a great book. I've listened to it twice. It's a wonderful audio, but it tells the story of Benedict Arnold, and it's told in such a way that you are feeling like you can be a part of this man's life. It's so, it's like a story. However, then we've got expository nonfiction, and that is strictly a book like with facts, gives information. So a great example there is the Seymour Simon books, and Tornadoes is one. And I chose that because we're in May and I'm in Oklahoma, and we have had some tornado excitement lately. So, what about chick lit, mystery, guys reads, horror, sports fiction, action adventure, paranormal, war, classics, humor, dystopia? These are all some common categories people have used in their libraries when they're genrefying libraries. These are not genres. These are subjects, categories, not genres. There are definite pros, people on the pro side of genrefying and people on the con side of genrefying, and this video is definitely not for that. However, I do want to say that you want to research both sides. The people on the pro side definitely say that their circulation does go up after they've genrefied the library. But then people on the other side, and I have to say I am on the side of not genrefying a library. There are other reasons not to genrefy a library. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but definitely research both sides. So now we're going to get into formats. Formats we have poetry, drama, novels, chapter books, short stories, picture books, graphic novels. Those are formats. A lot of times you'll see some of these formats listed as a genre in the genrefied library. People will put graphic novels as an area in their genrefied library, short stories, poetry. That's not the case. These are formats, and it's definitely something that you need to let kids know, because you can have a historical, realistic fiction, or on the realistic side of fiction, historical novel, or you can have historical poetry, historical graphic novel. So the graphic novel, the poetry, the novel, or those are formats that the particular genre will fit into. So let's look at this. We have Drowned City, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, a graphic novel that was written and illustrated by Don Brown. I love Don Brown. He also, his muted colors are kind of, they're not monotone necessarily, but they are kind of in that way. His Dust Bowl is another one that is just wonderful. That covers the Oklahoma Dust Bowl. I love it. But this is narrative nonfiction because it's told like a story, but it's in graphic novel format. So the genre is narrative nonfiction. The format is graphic novel. Next we have Meet the Dullards. This is a hysterical picture book. It's just a dry sense of humor. So it's low fantasy in a picture book format. Now, fantasy because, there are things that they're doing that, like in the background, look at the dog on the ball. This dog is a player throughout the entire story, and it's doing just crazy and outrageous things that definitely a dog cannot do. So it's low fantasy, but a picture book format. Slasher Girls and Monster Boys. This is fantasy, a low fantasy, in short story format. These are stories that definitely take place in worlds that we recognize. They are made up and involve instances of ghosts and other fantastical things, but definitely focus on character. And that is the biggest part of the plot, not any type of science. So it's not a science fiction. It's definitely low fantasy. It's horror, is what it is, but that's a subgenre of fantasy. And short story being the format. Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game is one that when I would first think of it, I would think, oh, there's a lot of science in that. They're in space, they're doing virtual reality gaming, they're aliens. I'm thinking, oh, that's hard science fiction. But it's not. It's soft science fiction. And that's because character is such an important part of this story. There is a lot of science involved with the aliens and the fighting of them. However, it focuses on Ender and the relationships he has with some people and what he does to grow and change throughout this book. If it focused more on the technical aspects of the training more, or the more of the science that goes into all of this, that might change it and make it more of a high science fiction. However, it's not. It's soft science fiction in a novel format. So, that is the presentation on genre and format. So be aware of these definitions when you're thinking of talking to kids about genres. Be sure to call them what they are: subgenres, categories, and that way students know that graphic novel is not a genre, or chick lit is not a genre. It's a category. So, I will say one thing. Let's go back and look at, and I said I wouldn't do this, however, let's go back and look at chick lit and guides reads and things like that. Think about what it does to a library or a student when he walks into that library and he's a guy and he decides he wants to read Twilight. And people have it in the romance section now. This is dated, I know, but when I was still a librarian in the middle school, Twilight was big, and guys were reading Twilight. However, would they walk over to the chick lit section and check out Twilight if it was in a chick lit section where people post it with pink and all of that? Sometimes people call those categories girl reads, like, opposite of the guy reads. Also, guy reads books that go into guy reads sections are generally ones that maybe are sports or more action adventure and espionage, things like that. Well, there are girls that like those books just as much as the guys. However, I would assume it'd probably be a little bit easier for the girls to go over to the guys read section, but why should they have to go over to a section for a book that they like in a guys read area? They like it too. Also, another problem with genrefying is there are books that go in a couple of different categories. Look at Twilight. It's a romance, but it's also, if people have a paranormal category, it would go to paranormal, or it's a fantasy. Look at, goodness. I've drawn a blank now. However, okay. So the thing is, it goes in multiple places. There are fantasies that are also historical. So where do you put those? In historical fiction or fantasy fiction? It becomes, the students kind of have to guess where they are going to find the books that they want. Sure, yes, they can go to the catalog and find it. That's what we want them to do anyway. But the genrefying library sets them up to browse and simply find books by browsing, because that's what you're telling them to do. If you like horrors, browse the horror section. You'll find everything you want to read there. However, if you don't think like they do, they're not going to find the book that you put over in war if they think it's dystopia or horror. So it really relies on the students and you kind of thinking the same way as far as categorizing these books. You know, it's a preference, and I'm not going to say you are totally free to do what you want in your own libraries. However, it is something to think about. Thank you for watching. Please comment on this video and start a discussion about genrefying. Pros and cons. Let's discuss. See you later. Dr. Lassane and I will be getting back together again. We're on a summer break right now between semesters. We will be meeting up again at our on campus on the 24th of May, and so we will most likely video something while we're together. If you have a topic for that we should video, send it to us in email, and you can find the email on our page, on the YouTube channel page. So thanks again for watching.